Okay, well, thank you all for coming to the second in our talks this afternoon. And the Social Science Department is hoping to help inform a discussion, help to stimulate even more discussion about the serious topic of African American history in our culture and in our country. And I wanted to point it out before turning this over that tomorrow there are two discussions, one at 11:30, perhaps a little bit of a lighter attitude as we discuss the history of Motown music, the relationship of the auto industry to the evolution of the music industry. So hopefully that'll be a little bit different tone than some of the other talks, but still important nonetheless. And then also tomorrow on Wednesday at 11:30, we'll be hearing about African Americans and the national pastime in American history. And we have two events to close out our symposium on Wednesday. One, we will have reflections on the 60s from several of our departmental members that were part of the civil rights movement. And we will close everything out at 1:30 on Wednesday with a poetry session from one of our colleagues in the English department. So thank you again for coming. I'm now going to turn this over to Professor Mike DeVivo, who's going to be speaking about African American migration, forced exodus from the old world, free passage in the new. Mike DeVivo.
Hello. You might wonder what a geographer is doing here, talking about African migration or what have you. You know, why isn't DeVivo out discovering a country or something? But this is actually an imperative subject within the field of geography, especially historical geography. I've conducted a bit of research and also instruction in this area over the last several years, and it's certainly an area that is far too large to cover in the short time that we have, but we'll hit upon some major points. And if you look at the screen, we have a map illustrating for us the first pathways, if you will, concerning movement of slaves from the old world, Africa, to the new world, essentially the Caribbean, and elsewhere in Latin America, some parts of North America, and then to the old world again, this time in Europe, and then back to the old world in Africa once again. And we have source regions for those individuals there. We also have a map here illustrating for us the pathways of migration from the south to the north. It's interesting that the African Americans that migrated during the Great Migration, post-Civil War, to the early part of the 20th century, essentially followed rail lines that had already been in place, and you can actually, for the most part, determine the points of origin in the American South of many of the African Americans that are residing in the North, as we have here a map illustrating the African American population in the United States today, largely existing in the southern part of the United States. So, let's look at this matter of Africans moving from Africa as a result of forced migration. But before we look at that, let's look at the character of the African continent, if you will. Can you see that? Let me see what we have to do here. Whoa. Hold on for a moment, please. Can you see that at all, folks? It's okay? Note, in the 12th century, the University of Timbuktu was founded. The University of Timbuktu is in sub-Saharan Africa, and this was certainly a very important institution of higher learning. Where's Timbuktu? Timbuktu is, at the risk of taking too much time to focus it, I'll just point my finger to Timbuktu right here, the northern part of Africa, okay? We have Timbuktu established really providing a higher quality of education for people throughout the entire African continent. Islam was an important subject that was to be studied, as well as language, in addition to astronomy, in addition to mathematics, in addition to geography. A number of subjects are studied here in this institution that predated Harvard. And, of course, we have this forced migration from the old world to the new world. How did it happen? Let's take a look at Alex Haley's roots for just a moment, if you would. It's a fictionalized account of his family's journey to America, this forced migration again. But, you know, Haley attempted to empathize with his ancestors. He took the trip himself on board a ship and slept on the boards as his ancestors were required to, although I don't believe he was shackled himself. He attempted to get an idea of the senses that they essentially experienced. And so here we have the one that was captured. He says, Kunta wondered if he had gone mad. Naked, chained, shackled, he awoke on his back between two other men in a pitch darkness full of steamy heat and sickening stink and a nightmarish bedlam of shrieking, weeping, praying, and vomiting. He could feel and smell his own vomit on his chest and belly. His whole body was one spasm of pain from the beatings he had received in the 4 days since his capture, but the place where the hot iron had been put between his shoulders hurt the worst. A rat's thick furry body brushed his cheek, its whiskered nose sniffing at his mouth. Quivering with revulsion, Kunta snapped his teeth together desperately, and the rat ran away. In rage, Kunta snatched and kicked against the shackles that bound his wrists and ankles. Instantly, angry exclamations and jerking came back from whomever he was shackled to. The shock and pain adding to his fury, Kunta lunged upward, his head bumping hard against wood, right on the spot where he had been clubbed by the Tubab back in the woods. Gasping and snarling, he and the unseen man next to him battered their iron cuffs at each other until both slumped back in exhaustion. Kunta felt himself starting to vomit again, and he tried to force it back, but couldn't. His already emptied belly squeezed up a thin, sour fluid that drained from the side of his mouth as he lay wishing that he might die. The middle passage, that part of that forced migration. How many Africans were forcibly migrated during that period of slavery? Ideas? 11 million. It's probably the best estimate, about 11 million. Interestingly, many people don't really have an idea as to how many actually came to the English colonies. How many came to the English colonies? More or less.
How many survived to the English colonies?
800,000.
Well, and the estimates are 500 to 800,000. Okay, 500 to 800,000, maybe 5%. The rest went to the Caribbean and then elsewhere in the Americas. Here we have, in 1629, 10 African slaves first brought to the Barbados. Why did they go to the Barbados? Right, sugar. They weren't going there for a vacation, that's for sure, okay? They went to the Barbados to engage in this new type of plantation economy that had just emerged in the world. This idea of being devoted to one particular crop, sugar, which was for the manufacturing, oftentimes, of rum, which was then traded, or I should say, which was then refined in the old world in Europe, and then profits from that were used to purchase textiles and trinkets and whatever you had to go ahead and purchase more slaves in Africa that would then be shipped again to the New World, and so on and so forth. This triangular slave trade takes place. Notice, 1636, we have a law passed in the Barbados that basically declares all slaves there are enslaved for life. And we find that within a very short period of time, we have 5,680 slaves in the Barbados. Here again, this plantation economy is developing, and we also have this being diffused throughout the Caribbean world and then into what is now Brazil and the three Guianas. Shortly afterward, we see South Carolina offering an incentive to settlers who bring in slaves, and that incentive is in the form of land allocations. More land is allocated to slave owners who bring male slaves rather than female slaves, but they bring in both, and they bring in slaves to South Carolina as plantations are developing there, which are devoted to, any ideas? What do you suppose they're going to devote themselves to? These slaves in South Carolina. Many people say cotton, but no, not cotton. Rice and indigo. Rice and indigo, okay? We see that rice is very important in the Carolinas, and indigo becomes very important because just prior to that time, this shellfish that secreted a purple bluish dye had become nearly extinct in the Mediterranean world because of pollution in the Mediterranean. And indigo was a plant that was harvested in the tropics that could actually emit this purple bluish dye that was highly sought after. But in the Carolinas, this place that was subtropical, not tropical, indigo did not produce the yields that were needed to make it economically feasible. So the British government provided a bounty, a benevolent subsidy to indigo planters in the Carolinas, and the slaves were used to go ahead and cultivate rice and indigo. Now, this is going to relate to the development of slaves here in South Carolina. Can you all see that okay? Is that all right? This is going to relate to this. We have 32,000 slaves in South Carolina in 1724. By 1765, we have 90,000 slaves in South Carolina. And we have this allegiance now to the crown. Why do we have this allegiance to the crown? Because the British crown is providing people with a means to gain some socioeconomic mobility, essentially upward. And if we look at this, oh, I'm sorry for this map here. It's just not showing well. But if you can, what if I turn the lights off? Let's see how that works. Is it a little better? Okay, let's do that. I'm sorry, folks. If we look at this map of the eastern seaboard, I'll just tell you the darker colors here in the Carolinas indicate areas where there happened to have been loyalist sympathies, as opposed to those sympathies more inclined to rebel against the crown during the Revolutionary War. And we see here are a number of places where we have most likely indigo plantations. People are going to be more devoted to align themselves with the British, and Raj will say, unfortunately, rather than to the cause of seceding from that form of government and creating a new country. I think that is very important for us to realize. There is this economic factor that certainly compelled people to move one way or the other. So the Revolutionary War occurred, ending essentially by treaty in 1783. But the last major battle had been fought a couple of years before that time. We have shortly thereafter a compromise, maintaining that each black in the South was worth 3/5 of a white person for the purposes of representation in Congress. And this new country is formed. And there's some debate, I guess, in today's circles concerning whether this whole institution of slavery would have died given the lack of feasibility for maintaining slaves in the South, because there was no sense in cultivating indigo anymore, because the Brits sure weren't going to provide price supports to this new country, and rice cultivation had come to a severe demise because of environmental matters. The soil compaction rendered many of the lands infertile. So very few lands were still suitable for rice cultivation, and slavery just wasn't feasible. It just really wasn't feasible. But what happens? We have Eli Whitney inventing the cotton gin in the 1790s. And this particular mechanical apparatus essentially separates the seed from the ball of cotton, and it makes slavery a very marketable enterprise. And it takes a civil war, essentially, in the United States to end it in 1865, which was the 13th Amendment. And we know the Emancipation Proclamation was proclaimed 2 years before the end of the Civil War, but it did not include those slaves held in bondage in the border states, essentially. Okay? What's interesting, too, is that we see slavery still practiced throughout the Americas till almost the end of the century. It doesn't end in Cuba until 1886, and is still a form of chattel slavery. It's interesting to see where that pattern of African American population happens to be during that era of slavery. Where is it? It's restricted to the South. It's restricted to the South. Where does it continue? It continues in the South, again, largely associated with the cultivation of cotton. This line here, this dashed line, indicates for you the northernmost extent of cotton cultivation because of climatic conditions, okay? And we see that cotton cultivation is going to occur actually throughout this darker colored area here. This is the Black Belt, and it wasn't known as the Black Belt because of the black population. It was known as the Black Belt because of environmental factors, okay? Let me see if I can. This map of cotton production is, I think, a little more easily identifiable, a little more descriptive, if you would. Okay, but again, this agricultural practice and slavery tend to go hand in hand, and yet we have this movement after the Civil War of African Americans toward the North. It doesn't happen immediately, and there aren't large numbers, but we do see a number of African Americans moving toward the North. As I showed you the map on the slide projector before, many are following rail lines, okay? So we could trace the a number of black neighborhoods in New Haven, New York, Boston, to people who came from Florida, Virginia, and the Carolinas. By the same token, many in Detroit and Chicago could be traced to their source of origin being in Louisiana, Tennessee, Arkansas, and there's this geographical relationship there. And it also relates then to this notion of a homeland of sorts. If you ask Whoopi Goldberg, where is she, where are her people from, what might Raj say? He might say Ireland. Mike might say Ireland. Steve might say, Syria or whatever. I might say Italy. Whoopi Goldberg will say Florida. All right? And we can see that this black population in the year 1900 is steadily moving northward, particularly in the Northeast. This is the beginning of the Great Migration. And we note that the occurrence of this Great Migration is concomitant with this, what I refer to as this third peak of European immigration into the United States, when many immigrants, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe, migrated into the cities of the Northeast and the Midwest. Industrialization is occurring. America's in the midst of an industrial revolution, and blacks from the South were able to find jobs in the North for a number of reasons. One, they were paid much less than these white immigrants, and there were a lot of jobs available. There was a lot of work available. So this great migration is occurring full force. We see that the African-American population in Detroit in 1910 is 5741. And up until the 1960s, 6 million African-Americans are moving from the South to the North. By 1930, the African-American population in Detroit is 120,000. By 1950, it's 300,000. Incidentally, today, the African-American population in Detroit is 686 plus thousand, 82% of the population. This migration is phenomenal. Now, I had the opportunity a number of years ago to work in a program when I was associated with Pennsylvania University for several years. I worked with this program devoted to encouraging inner city youth to achieve a college education. The idea was to encourage them first to finish high school, as Harrisburg, Pennsylvania was one city in Pennsylvania where the high school dropout rate was over 50%. I believe here in Grand Rapids the high school dropout rate is also over 50%. And many of these high schools, of course, are characterized by inner city youth. Well, we were pretty successful. We had a number of students that did actually succeed in going to college, and I think only one student, perhaps two, in the 5 years that the program was in existence, failed to finish high school. So it was considered somewhat of a success, but like a number of other things, funding was problematic, and the program ceased to exist after a while. But I was responsible for this geographical expedition, and one of the things that I happened to think was important was bringing the students to the Smithsonian Institution, the American History Museum, where there was this from field to factory exhibit where they could actually have a docent-guided tour concerning the experiences of these African-American migrants during this great migration. And they were able then to identify with these stories, as they could comment on the same kinds of stories in their own families. And it was interesting that many of these students would talk about how they had this yearning for the South. There was this great desire to go back to the South. The sense of family was very important. The sense of family, the sense of this homeland of sorts. In geography, we have this term referring to an affinity for a place. It's called topophilia. an affinity for a place. And these people, these youngsters had this topophilia for the American South. And one wondered, were their direct ancestors, maybe their grandparents, really right in their decisions to come to the North instead of remaining in the South? And there was some debate about this, especially since many of them in these northern neighborhoods were forced into this ghettoization, this fragmentation of society that forced the segregation among various ethnic and racial groups. And they were, in many ways, disenfranchised from the rest of society. And as a result, there would be drive-by shootings they would comment on frequently. The street pharmacists dealing drugs, oftentimes as well, were essentially common characteristics in their communities. And they talked about these things. And this presented another problem and some other thought. And I'd like to address some of these with you because it's important for us to look at other aspects of African American society in relation to other ethnic groups. So let's look at this and see if it works. Come on, baby. Oh. There we go. Let's look at this. How's that? Is that okay? Can you read that at all? Okay. Black, Hispanic, and non-Hispanic white unemployment 2002. Okay? If we look at certain economic variables such as unemployment, we see that there's certainly a racial disparity or an ethnic disparity, where black unemployment is significantly higher than white or non-Hispanic white and Hispanic. Let's look at poverty with regard to percentage of population. Non-Hispanic white percentage of population living in poverty is 7.8. These are national figures, by the way. Okay? Black and Hispanic are pretty close to the same. 22.7% for black, 21.4% for Hispanic. So we basically have, what? More than 1 out of every 5 black families is living in poverty in this country, compared to certainly less than, what? 1 out of 13 white families living in poverty. Other measures that you won't hear about very often relate to IMR, infant mortality rate, number of deaths per 1,000 live births, okay? We have totals for the U.S. and a number of states. All right, U.S., Michigan, New York, Florida, California, Texas, and Tennessee. Non-Hispanic white, IMR, is in the 5s or the 6s in general throughout the United States. 5.4 non-Hispanic white infants die per 1,000 live births in a given year. But let's look at this for blacks in particular. We see a much higher IMR among blacks throughout the United States. Nationally, 14.7, as well as in certain states. Look at Michigan's IMR, 16.6 black infants die per 1,000 live births, which is matched with Tennessee almost with 17.3. We see that in some southern states, African American IMR is even lower than in Michigan. So we see this great disparity. Why is that IMR so much higher among blacks in Michigan than among non-Hispanic whites? Any ideas? Anybody have any ideas? Thoughts? Healthcare is a biggie, okay? And no jobs, no healthcare. Well, there are some opportunities for health care, but there's also, and I've talked to individuals associated with providing health care for African American women, especially African American women who are in various stages of pregnancy. And the bottom line is, who are the doctors? Are the doctors white or are they black? In general, they're white doctors. And who is going to trust them? There is this tremendous distrust toward the white establishment. And that's in Grand Rapids, folks. That's right here in Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids, USA, home of the Raiders, okay? There's this tremendous distrust. And until that distrust is alleviated, there are going to be certainly substantially greater problems. You know, Professor Light, what, half an hour ago, 40 minutes ago or so, was talking about how we essentially have a society that is marked by various degrees of apathy and oblivion concerning the economic disparities. And as long as these economic disparities tend to increase or tend to be pervasive across the country, we have a population that is pushed to the brink of despair, as was identified, or I should say, as was typified in that riot in L.A. Let's look at a few other things. Family type. And herein it is thought that much of the problem lies. Non-Hispanic whites, we find that 82% of the families are married couple families in non-Hispanic white households, all right? Whereas a minority of blacks are in married couple families. We find that this tends to be looked at more and more often by sociologists and anthropologists as a particular problem associated with this, these other phenomena that we are examining. This decline of the family unit. And this goes back to what I was talking about concerning this topophilia that these students had for the South. And as a result, what has happened? In the 1970s and the 1980s, there was this return migration to the South. There was this return migration to the South because of this disillusionment with the North. This disillusionment in terms of what? The high crime that was pervasive, same sorts of injustices in the North as there happened to be in the South. Only thing is, there was this greater ghettoization. If we look at college campuses in this state, in Michigan, you know, are there any college campuses that are not ghettoized? Grand Valley, U of M, MSU. When I say they're ghettoized, I'm saying that you have significantly altered the structure of these institutions, whether it's self-imposed by the students or not. They're highly segregated in terms of their residences. Is that not the case? Is that not the case? Does anybody know of any other circumstance? You know, we have that, and so how can we foster this notion of integration? That's it's a question that I raise. I don't really have the answer to. But we have people going to the South from African American families in the North. We have this return migration, partly because of cost of living too, but again, because of that topophilia, that attachment. Professor Light brought up incarceration rates. Check this out. Black incarceration rates much higher in these selected states and in the U.S. in general than non-Hispanic whites. Hispanics are somewhere in between. But let's look at this. Percentage of blacks among resident population and incarcerated population. In the U.S., the percentage of the population of blacks is 12.3. It's variable, 13, give or take a few decimal points. Percentage of incarcerated. 43.7% of those incarcerated in the United States are African Americans. And parts of the puzzle are beginning to come together. You have so many men that are incarcerated. You have so many broken homes. You have so many children that have no opportunity to make it beyond their first year of birth. And I maintain that the key is education. So when Professor Light was talking about reparations, which seems to be justified, arguably, one of the ways it might be employed is to provide greater access to education in a number of ways, because there's certainly disparity in terms of the educational attainment according to various ethnic groups. Non-Hispanic whites are more likely to achieve higher levels of education than blacks. If we look at racial and ethnic diversity in U.S. undergraduates, we see that, again, that disproportion is very well pronounced. And yet, we have a society that has decided in this state not to foster this idea of affirmative action in some of the leading academic institutions, such as the University of Michigan, where two legal cases, Grutter versus Bollinger and Gratz versus Bollinger, were brought before the Supreme Court. Without going into great details, I'd like to suggest that there was some rationale behind affirmative action plans. There we go. Sorry. Behind some of those affirmative action plans being in place. And perhaps one of the greatest arguments for affirmative action came from leaders in the armed forces, where leaders in the armed forces, the superintendents at all of the military academies, in addition to some rather significant veterans, General Schwarzkopf, for example, Senator Bob Kerrey, for example, argued that it was imperative to have this type of program in the stellar institutions of the United States. The end of segregation in the U.S. Armed Forces during the Korean conflict came from a principled recognition that segregation is unjust and incompatible with American values, but also from a practical recognition that the military's need for manpower and its efficient, effective deployment required integration. In subsequent decades, with the war in Vietnam raging in the 60s and 70s, a racial problem existed which was considered by the military's leadership to be so critical it was on the verge of self-destruction. The military was on the verge of self-destruction. This realization prompted the armed forces to increase numbers among the minority officer ranks and also provide training to officers in diverse educational environments. Efforts toward achieving diversity in the armed forces are evidenced in this table right here. As the military is arguably the most heterogeneous of American institutions in this society. 61.7% of the total servicemen are white. With that date is wrong. With let me check that just for a second. That may be a misprint. With, I believe, 18% of the percentage of officers are white. 8% of the officers are black, with 21% of the total servicemen involved. The bottom line is this is a highly heterogeneous society, the United States is. And we do have some heterogeneous institutions. We also had briefs filed by the chairman of the board of General Motors Corporation, Ford, Steelcase, Ford Grutter versus Rollinger, Gratz versus Bollinger, that maintained that it was imperative to have African Americans in leadership positions. And these stellar institutions, like the University of Michigan, ranked number 25 in the country overall, provide a training ground for those individuals. And to reduce the opportunities for enrollment is actually a tragedy in the making. To sum it up, I think we have to realize that race in higher education is important to recognize, and that these opportunities, our lack of opportunities, essentially stem from this entire history that we've been talking about all day. And race in higher education must be addressed. And providing opportunities to African Americans might be, or increasing the opportunities to African Americans, might be a pragmatic approach in addressing reparations. You know, there's been 150 years of discrimination and inequity that's occurred since emancipation. And only in this context can it be realized that educating the downtrodden masses, characterized by, what did we talk about? High levels of poverty, infant mortality, imprisonment. Educating these people is essentially a moral imperative